Okay, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining us today on World Hypertension Day for this webinar, The Caribbean Mobilizing to Eliminate Industrially Produced Trans Fats. My name is Maisha Hutton, and I am the Executive Director of the Healthy Caribbean Coalition. I bring greetings to you from the President and the Board of Directors of the HCC. This webinar is hosted by the HCC with the support of Resolve to Save Lives and in proud partnership with CARICOM, the OACS Commission, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, or CARFA, the Pan American Health Organization, PAHO, the Caribbean Public Health Law Forum, the Law and Health Research Unit at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, the Healthy Bahamas Coalition, the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Barbados, the Heart Foundation of Jamaica, Lake Health and Wellbeing in St. Kitts and Nevis, and the St. Lucia Diabetes and Hypertension Association. In 2022, a decision was taken by CARICOM member states to eliminate industrially produced trans fatty acids from the regional food supply by the 31st of December, 2025. Presently, no CARICOM country has national TFA legislation. HCC is contributing to the effort to make the elimination a reality by using its advocacy and convening power. The aim of this webinar today is to build awareness and support for the elimination of industrially produced trans fats in the Caribbean. Industrially produced trans fats found in various packaged and ready-to-eat foods contribute to adverse health outcomes, particularly heart disease. Across CARICOM, there is momentum building to implement TFA legislation. Civil society has an important role to play in building public awareness, support, and demand for TFA regulation, thereby creating the political space for policymakers to accelerate action. HCC has been advocating for healthy food policies since 2017, when we launched our Civil Society Action Plan for Childhood Obesity Prevention. The plan called for key food policies such as taxation of sweetened beverages, regulating the sale and marketing of ultra-processed products in school settings, and introducing octagonal fronted package warning labeling on prepackaged foods. TFA regulation is an important, highly cost-effective, and relatively low-hanging policy measure. And so, earlier this year, the HCC signed a grant with Resolve to Save Lives to fund civil society advocacy efforts to complement the work of key regional partners across various sectors mobilizing around this agenda. This regional TFA webinar is one of the key project activities. Over the next 2 hours, you will learn more about trans fatty acids, their dangers, the importance of TFA regulation, global best practices and lessons learned in TFA elimination, and the roles that are being played by diverse regional actors as we move towards that December 2025 deadline. The webinar is divided into 3 sections: opening remarks from our regional partners, followed by technical presentations, a panel discussion, and we wrap up with a Q&A session. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that both the chat and the Q&A features are enabled, and we encourage you, as always, to use these features to share your experiences and ask questions. Our experts will be monitoring the chat and the Q&A and responding to your questions and comments in real time. Thanks to all of you again who've taken time out of your busy schedules to join us. And with that, we're going to get started. I would like to invite Ms. Helen Royer. She is the Director of the Human and Social Development Division at CARICOM, and she's going to provide us with some opening remarks. Over to you, Dr. Royer.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Didicus Jules, Director General, OACS Commission. Mr. Dean Chambliss, Caribbean Sub-Regional Program Director, PAHO. Dr. Heather Armstrong, Head Chronic Disease and Injury at CARFA. Maisha Hutton, Executive Director, HCC. Distinguished panelists from the Caribbean Public Health Agency, PAHO, the OACS Commission, CARFA, the Law and Health Research Unit, Heart Stroke Foundation of Barbados, Healthy Bahamas Coalition, Heart Foundation, and St. Lucia's Diabetes and Hypertension Association. Webinar participants, good afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests and members of civil society, it is my pleasure to bring you greetings from the CARICOM Secretariat as we commence this important webinar on the elimination of industrially produced trans fat in the Caribbean. Today, we are reminded of the urgent need to address the growing threat of non-communicable diseases in our region and the role that trans fatty acids play in their development. Across the Caribbean, NCDs continue to be a major cause of morbidity and mortality, with cardiovascular disease being the leading cause of death. The consumption of industrially produced trans fat has been shown to increase the risk of heart disease, stroke, and other NCDs, and is a major contributor to the burden of disease in our region. The World Health Organization has estimated that globally, over 500,000 deaths occur each year as a result of TFA consumption, with over 40,000 of those deaths occurring in the Americas. The fifth meeting of the Council for Trade and Economic Development, COTED, and the Council of Human and Social Development approved the establishment of two intergovernmental working groups supported technically and administratively by the CARICOM Secretariat and the Caribbean Public Health Agency to address the threat posed to the Caribbean people by the unhealthy diets and obesogenic food environments and the harmful use of alcohol, respectively. The CARICOM Secretariat and CAFA served as a joint secretariat to each intergovernmental working group and convened meetings of core members, including regional institutions, international development partners, non-governmental organizations, and civil society organizations. The work plan included developing a regional program for the elimination of industrially produced trans fat and aimed to establish targets and timelines for achieving the elimination in the region. The measures considered included achieving a legal limit of 0 industrially produced trans fat from total fat in all oils, fats, and foods produced and marketed in the region, providing technical assistance to the manufacturers to produce industrially produced trans fat free from food products, banning the importation of sale of products with industrially produced trans fat, and enforcing compliance with policies and regulations, promoting health education, and additionally, the program includes a monitoring and evaluation system to assess the reduction of salt in the food supply. The timeframe for the working group has expired and a new group will be established to advance the work. However, we all know that achieving this goal will not be easy. It will require the continued collaboration and cooperation of all stakeholders, including civil society, the private sector, the government. Sustained effort will be required to raise awareness of the dangers of industrially produced trans fat consumption and to build support for the necessary regulatory policies. This webinar, therefore, with resolve to save lives, is an important step in this direction. It provides an opportunity to showcase global best practices and lessons learned and is expected to build awareness of regulatory approaches and pathways for the elimination of trans fat in CARICOM. It is our hope that through this webinar, we can build regional support for the accelerated enactment of regulatory policies in CARICOM member states to eliminate industrially produced trans fat from the food supply. In closing, the Secretariat wishes to thank the organizers and other partners for their support in making this webinar possible. I wish you a fruitful and productive discussion and the continued development of concrete actions planned to eliminate industrially produced trans fat from the Caribbean food supply. Again, it's regretful that the Assistant Secretary General, who would have liked to be here today, is unable because of other competing priorities. So regrets on her behalf, and I wish you all the best. I also want to inform that I have to move now because I am attending another meeting out of state. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you for your support, Ms. Roy. We appreciate you jumping in.
Thank you.
So these are the opening remarks. We've heard from CARICOM. Now we're going to hear from the Director General of the OECS Commission. And we have pre-recorded remarks.
Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and fellow healthy living advocates. Industrially produced trans fatty acids, commonly known as iTFAs, are known to cause ill health. They are considered to be the tobacco of food by result to save lives, because they contribute to adverse health outcomes, particularly cardiovascular diseases. Approximately 278,000 deaths each year globally are attributed to heart disease resulting from the consumption of these industrially produced trans fatty acids. Trans fatty acids, as you know, are unsaturated fatty acids. They are primarily produced industrially and commonly derived from partially hydrogenated oils used in food processing. These fats are found in various packaged and ready-to-eat foods. They've been banned in approximately half of all countries globally. And in 2022, PHOs endorsed a decision to remove them from our food supply by 2025. As the CARICOM Secretariat moves towards industrially produced trans fatty acid legislation, the OECS Commission fully supports this position and will support the OECS member states in achieving this goal. This is an especially important opportunity for a win against the background of lagging progress in other NCD areas, including unhealthy diet policies such as front of package warning labeling, the taxation of ultra-processed products, alcohol control, and the implementation of the World Health Organization's Framework Convention of Tobacco Control. With the high-level meeting on non-communicable diseases at the United Nations General Assembly coming around the corner in September 2025, we in the OECS and CARICOM ought to take stock and set out priorities to meet the SDGs. This is an important opportunity for the region to signal to its citizens that our governments prioritize our health. We are aware of the efforts being made by certain private sector interests in the region and beyond who are opposed to these health initiatives. Among the specious arguments raised have been the cost of relabeling products. There can be no equation of human health and well-being against the cost of commercial labeling charges. iTFA regulation has the potential to be the catalyst for accelerated policy across the region, and we in the OECS stand firmly in support. Industrially produced trans fatty acids should be declared on the nutrition label of conventional foods and dietary supplements and identified by the octagonal warning label. Navigating the complex landscape of nutrition should not be a privilege, but a fundamental right accessible to all. Through the implementation of octagonal food labels, which clearly and effectively identify products that are high in sugars, sodium, and fats, and harmful to health, we seek to fortify public health by fostering informed food choices and nudging manufacturers towards reformulating their products to healthier alternatives in a world where non-communicable diseases such as diabetes and cardiovascular conditions continue to climb the ladder of global health threats. I may add that this also provides an opportunity for our producers to get in the game of competition for organic foods and foods that meet these requirements. iTFA regulation and the octagonal food labeling system not only assist consumers in making immediate healthy food choices, but also work as a subtle yet constant reminder of the pertinence of nutritional vigilance. As a region, embracing both amplifies our unified commitment towards safeguarding the health and well-being of our citizens, families, and children. It emphasizes our collective pursuit to advocate for transparency, accountability, and consumer empowerment in the food industry across our integrated nations. May our nations in the region stand united under the banner of health to safeguard the health of communities and promote sustained well-being for all.
Thank you, Dr. Jules, for those powerful remarks. I'd now like to invite Mr. Dean Chambliss. He's the Caribbean Subregional Program Director at PHO. Dean, over to you.
Good morning, colleagues. Good morning, Maisha. Just getting my video going here. It seems to be taking its time.
We can see you. Great.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. Colleagues and partners, good morning. I think protocol has already been established, so with permission, I will go ahead and make some brief remarks this morning. It is indeed so exciting to see the work on eliminating industrially produced trans fats moving forward in the Caribbean. Only 2 months ago here in Barbados, we welcomed delegates from 6 countries and territories to a workshop on legislation and legal drafting of regulatory tools for industrially produced trans fatty acids elimination and sodium targets in packaged foods. Today, we extend our greetings to the wider region and to all our partners as we continue this work together. The Caribbean is at a pivotal moment. The region will soon join the 60 countries worldwide where mandatory trans fatty acid or TFA policies protect 3.4 billion people, 43% of the global population. In 2022, the CARICOM COTED and the Council for Human and Social Development, or COSAD, affirmed the commitment of CARICOM member states to establish regulations and legislation targeting a 0% legal limit of industrially produced trans fats in our food supply by 2025. This commitment provides a unique opportunity to advance public health and protect lives in our region. As we frequently discuss, NCDs are the leading cause of death globally, and particularly in the region of the Americas. However, given our diverse audience, it is important to reiterate some key points, especially today as we observe World Hypertension Day. Hypertension is a major modifiable factor for cardiovascular disease, and we are aware of several nutritional risk factors for NCDs. These include high sodium, high sugar, and saturated fat consumption. The confluence of these factors impacts NCDs and necessitates holistic action. Industrially produced trans fats are a preventable contributor to cardiovascular diseases, the leading cause of death in Latin America and the Caribbean. The urgency to eliminate trans fats cannot be overstated. The latest available estimate using a comprehensive analytic approach suggests that globally, 537,000 deaths from CHD were attributable to TFA intake, and of these, 160,000 occurred in the region of the Americas. And of these, 45% were premature deaths. This toll is why WHO developed a plan to eliminate industrially produced TFAs worldwide by 2023 through the Replace initiative. Launched in 2018, this initiative is a roadmap to equip governments to eliminate or replace industrially produced TFAs. It is being successfully implemented in the Americas through best practice policies. Considering that over 43% of the world's population has already put this standard in place, it's imperative that the Caribbean take swift and decisive action. This is not only in alignment with global health standards, but also ensures compliance with the mandates of trading partners. Implementing policies and legislation to ban partially hydrogenated oils and industrial trans fatty acids will reduce the burden of NCDs in the Caribbean, decrease associated healthcare costs, and lower economic costs due to lost productivity from related illnesses. Great opportunities exist for governments and civil society to take action. Building awareness is essential to promote buy-in and empower consumers to make healthier choices. It is also important to review sources of TFAs in the food supply and encourage manufacturers and producers to reformulate products and adopt healthier alternatives. Improving the policy landscape by implementing regulatory measures to eliminate TFAs and enforce compliance are also crucial. Furthermore, harmonizing partially hydrogenated oils bans with regulations of key commercial partners, including North America, Mercosur, the European Union, and other countries in the Americas, who have banned PHOs and limited TFA content in foods, will strengthen our efforts and ensure a healthier future for the Caribbean. PHO stands ready to support you, governments, civil society, and partners, offering proven policy and legislative models, as well as tools and training to build the regulatory capacity needed to win the fight against NCDs. Our webinar today is another step towards building a whole of society approach, which will secure better health outcomes and ultimately save lives. Together with civil society organizations, CARFA, CARICOM, HCC, UE, and our regional partners, Resolve to Save Lives, we are committed to supporting the steps required to implement the policies and mechanisms necessary for a trans fatty acid-free Caribbean. Let us move swiftly to put these measures in place. Thank you for your attention and for your active participation on this auspicious World Hypertension Day. Back to you, Maisha.
Thank you so much. And now we're going to wrap up our opening remarks with comments from Dr. Heather Armstrong. She is the head of chronic disease and injury in the Chronic Disease and Injury Department, Surveillance Disease Prevention and Control at CARFA. Dr. Armstrong, over to you.
Thank you, Maisha. Ladies and gentlemen, special invited guests, speakers, panelists, and participants, it is a pleasure to address you today on behalf of the Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARFA, as we gather to discuss a vitally important health initiative, eliminating industry-produced trans fatty acids from our food supply. Our region faces a significant challenge with NCDs, particularly cardiovascular diseases, which remain the leading cause of death in Latin America and the Caribbean. Implementing the 6-point policy package developed to combat childhood obesity is crucial for addressing NCDs in the region. We are aware of the challenges ahead, including implementation, surveillance, and monitoring of the policy areas. Nevertheless, CARFA continues to work with our partners, supporting the interagency committee convened to monitor and coordinate the implementation of the 6-point policy package. The committee, comprising representatives from CARFA, other CARICOM institutions like CrossQ and CARDI, and regional partners like FAO and PHO, and other vital stakeholders like HCC, periodically review the implementation status, identify any promising or best practices, and strategies to address gaps in implementing the 6-point policy package. Their role is crucial in ensuring the effective and coordinated implementation of the 6 PPP across our member states. Recognizing the critical role that diet plays in the prevalence of NCDs, CARFA, supported by PHO and other partners, has taken decisive action to address this preventable cause of health burden through the elimination of partially hydrogenated oils. In January 2023, CARFA, as part of the CARICOM Intergovernmental Working Group on Unhealthy Diets and Obesogenic Food Environments, launched a 4-day virtual training workshop to address a pivotal part of our 6-point policy package. The workshop focused on equipping participants with the skills and knowledge necessary to develop effective policies for improving the nutritional quality of our food supply. 29 technical officers from the Ministry of Health and the Attorney General's chambers of 11 CARFA member states attended the workshop. Upon the successful conclusion of the training, 6 countries, inspired by the knowledge gained, subsequently developed draft policy briefs aimed at prohibiting these harmful facts. This reflects the effectiveness of our collaborative efforts and the dedication of our member states. CARFA has and will continue to provide technical support to all of its member states as they lead in developing, finalizing, and implementing policies to ban the production, importation, distribution, sale, and use of industrially produced trans fatty acids in foods for human consumption. In March 2024, CARFA participated in a regional Barbados workshop focused on legislative approaches and policy implementation for trans fat elimination. Our participation and leadership in these discussions underscore our ongoing commitment to this cause. Adopting legislative measures across our member states to limit or ban industrially produced trans fatty acids would be a significant regulatory achievement. This cost-effective strategy promises substantial public health benefits. As we look ahead, let's pause to celebrate the collective milestones we've reached. Your contributions, whether big or small, are invaluable. Together, we're striving toward our shared goals under the Port of Spain Declaration the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and other global commitments to nutrition and health. In closing, I want to express my heartfelt gratitude to everyone present. Your commitment to public health and continued partnership in this crucial endeavor is not just important, but essential. As representatives of your respective member states and organizations, each of you play a vital role in our collective efforts towards a healthier future for all our people. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Armstrong. Wonderful remarks from our colleagues and partners working at the regional level to move this agenda towards a reality. We're now going to shift into the presentations, and I'd like to introduce the presenters now. First, we have Professor Alafia Samuels. She is an honorary professor at the Caribbean Institute for Health Research at the University of the West Indies. She's also the technical consultant on this project. The HCC is being funded through Resolve to Save Lives. Next, we have Dr. Rashid Perry. He's a PhD researcher, but he's also one of the researchers of some really important groundbreaking work that was done on TFA assessments in Jamaica. And we'll hear more about that. Then we have Ms. Liz Drummond. She is a technical advisor in nutrition and trans fat elimination at Resolve to Save Lives. Then we'll hear from Cheryl Dennis Wright. She is a consultant, health, law, and regulation at PHO. And finally, we'll wrap up the presentations with Dr. Gloria Giraldo, the advisor in NCDs and mental health at PHO. So with that, I'm going to invite Professor Alafia Samuels to share her screen. Over to you, Alafia.
Thank you very much, Maisha. Good morning to everyone. Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can see it and we can hear you clearly.
Okay, very good. Okay, all protocols being observed, we'll just jump into it. So we know that fat is important. The human brain is 60% fat. It carries a number of important vitamins necessary for cell growth and for energy and acts as a cushion. But fat availability and consumption in Jamaica is over the recommended limit, as you can see the red bar going across. And we are importing quite a bit of this consumption. Thanks to Professor Henry for this slide. In terms of types of fat, we have saturated and unsaturated fat. We are usually, accustomed to hearing about saturated fats and animal fat and so on. But on the unsaturated fat side, we have trans fats and we have different forms of trans fats, and we'll talk about that in a second. So the problem is not that we're eating too much fat. It is, we are eating too much fat, and we're also eating the wrong types of fat. So in terms of trans fatty acids, we know that the health impact is that they increase bad cholesterol, they lower good cholesterol, they affect platelet function and other cell structures, and they are associated with a 34% increase in all-cause mortality and a 28% increase in coronary heart disease, heart attack mortality. These effects are dose-related, so those people who consume more trans fat will have an even higher increase in mortality and so on. Trans fat also diminishes mental performance, depression, cognitive decline, and Alzheimer's. And this is just a graphic to show the impact of the different types of fat in mortality. So starting with the good news, things like nuts and salmon and olive oil, things like avocados and so on, will actually reduce your mortality, even though they are fats. So they are the good fats. Above the line, we see saturated fat, and we're accustomed to hearing about red meat, butter, cheese, and so on, which increase. But if you look at trans fat, you can see that their impact is much quicker and much more severe. So it is a major problem for us to address. How does trans fat impact our health? We get plaque buildup in the arteries. And when the plaque blocks arteries to the brain, you have a stroke, and they block arteries to the heart, you have a heart attack. And remember that these are the leading causes of death in the Caribbean. When we look at NCD mortality, I want to point out the bottom right-hand corner, which shows that in the Caribbean, 45% of our NCD mortality is premature, taking place between 30 and 70 years old, and that is higher than global and the Americas. our people are dying young. And they are dying mostly from non-communicable diseases, of which cardiovascular disease, including heart attack and stroke, make up the major portion. So as I mentioned, we have the highest rate of premature mortality rate in the region of the Americas. And recall that small island developing states import between 60 to 80, and in fact, in St. Kitts, 95% of their foods. And low and middle income countries often lack capacity to test. Partially hydrogenation of oils creates trans fat. There is no known hydrogenation taking place in the Caribbean, which means that we are importing our industrially produced trans fat. So there are different types of trans fats that we have to take recognition of. 3 sources. There's a naturally occurring trans fat produced in ruminant animals, and it comprises about 5% of total fat in meat and milk products. Our focus, however, are the second types of trans fats. These are industrially produced trans fats, which are man-made through a process of hydrogenation. And then these hydrogenated fats are used in food preparation. You do get some industrially produced trans fats also when you, with the refinement of vegetable oils, when oils and fats are heated and reheated, as occurs in fast food operations. But partially hydrogenated oils are the most abundant source of industrially produced TFAs in foods. And trans fat is found in many foods. All the foods you see there have trans fats. The thing is that although these foods are not healthy, in the United States, for example, they don't have trans fats. But in the Caribbean, they do have trans fats. So that is a challenge for us. Consumers are not being protected from this contaminant, and I use the word advisedly. This is what the Canadians have labeled industrially produced trans fats. They've labeled it a contaminant, and so it is treated just like, you know, any other contaminant. It's banned, and they're not allowed to have it. So as I mentioned before, you know, we import a lot, and including a lot of the oils that we import. It's been increasing over time, and the sources of the oils that we import, as you can see, number 1 is the United States, and then number 3 is Canada, and so on. And these 2 countries have banned trans fats, so it is unlikely that partially hydrogenated oils are coming from these countries. However, Indonesia and Malaysia are significant suppliers of oils, and it is possible that that is where the partial hydrogenation is coming from, but this is something that needs to be investigated. So we know, has been mentioned before, there are policies for many millions, billions of people in many countries, none in CARICOM. In fact, almost 80% of high-income countries have policies, less in upper middle and lower middle, and none in the CARICOM, as I mentioned. WHO has targeted elimination of trans fats, and you will hear more about this in the coming presentation, so I will skip this and replaces what the WHO is proposing. As was mentioned before, the CARICOM has done work on industrially produced trans fat elimination, and in April 2022, this is a resolution that was passed, basically saying the second line, developing a policy position to work towards regulation and legislation for prohibition of partially hydrogenated oils for December 2023, no later than 2024. I don't know if anybody met it. I don't think anybody met the 2023 deadline. And then the removal by December 2025. So that's what we're working towards. So just to talk a little bit about what's been happening in Jamaica. In 2018, the labs were upgraded. In 2021, Minister Tufton reported results in Parliament of some testing that our next speaker is going to go into detail about that testing, but he reported it. And since 2022, the Ministry of Health, myself and others have been working with the Jamaica Manufacturers and Exporters Association to try to move this agenda forward. There have been several seminars, but for the past 6 months or so, there has been a stall because the next seminar was supposed to engage Jamaican manufacturers that have already removed trans fat, and the JMEA is having trouble getting commitment from any of those manufacturers to participate in this process. This is a photograph of when the upgraded labs were turned over to the Government of Jamaica, Bureau of Standards, and the Scientific Research Council. This was in 2019, and this was based on a UWI project funded by the IDRC of Canada. There has been some effort at advocacy in the region. And the approach has been two-pronged. The legislation calling for a global ban and direct engagement with the private sector in order to move this forward. So we have to engage with the food industry because they are the people who feed people. We don't feed people. This is a technical food production issue, which has to be implemented by food manufacturers. And some of the smaller companies may need technical assistance. Many regional manufacturers already export to markets where TFAs are regulated, and thus they have had to remove trans fat in order to meet the requirements of the importing countries. So they have the internal expertise on how to do that. We are trying to encourage them to share, but there has been no uptake of that offer for them to share their knowledge with their other manufacturers. It's necessary for regional manufacturers to work together and to get partners to establish the system to remove trans fats. And finally, I just wanted to point out that this initiative actually has support of the global private sector. So the International Food and Beverage Alliance, working with the WHO, have a whole program around targeting their fellow private sector colleagues on how to remove trans fats. And so it's important, I think, to press on with this work. I think that, just like in any disease, you have primary prevention and secondary prevention. And I think we need to look more at the sort of upstream prevention of trans fats. So yes, you can have individual countries that are passing legislation and so on, but the most effective thing to do would be to identify the global sources of those few countries that are still hydrogenating oils and attack the thing at its source. Resolve to save lives. Bloomberg, I'm looking at you right now for help with this. So yes, I think we need to work locally and we also need to work globally. Let's go for it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Samuels. That was excellent. So we should all have a better understanding of what TFAs are now and the dangers of trans fatty acids. Now over to Dr. Rashid Perry to share about the research that he's done in Jamaica. So we can see you for sure, see your slides full screen, and we can hear you. Fantastic.
All right, perfect. Let me just minimize this. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me. Today, I'll be talking about a study I was a part of, looking at an assessment of industrially produced trans fat and saturated fat content of food products in Jamaica. I know I only have 10 minutes. I'm going to try my best to get through all the information that we'll be discussing. So with that being said, let me save some time and not go through the outline, and we'll just jump straight into our discussion. So the main objective of this study was to determine the concentrations of industrially produced trans and saturated fatty acids in consumed food products in Jamaica. Now, the method that we adopted for this study was based on the WHO global protocol for the assessment of trans fatty acids. So what that protocol entailed was a sampling method where we had three main groups. We had fats and oils, packaged foods, and ready-to-eat samples. We had to collect at least 100 grams of each sample. So what you'll find is we may have to collect multiple samples because not all would have met the criteria. Now, once we had collected our samples and prepared them, we then sent them to the labs. Now, as Professor Samuels had spoken to, our labs back in 2008, now had the, not 2008, 2018, now had the capacity to test for a wider range of compounds, including our fatty acids, sodium, sugars, etc. Now, for fatty acids, they utilize a technology called gas chromatography with flame ionization detector. Won't go into much detail as to how it works, but pretty much you put the sample in the vessel. That sample is taken through a chamber. The chamber is heated. At the end, we have a detector and our computer, and then we'll end up with graphs, which would indicate the fatty acids that we've identified. Now, when we talk about trans fats, we have to also take into account as Professor Samuel said, the types of trans fats, but trans fats may have varying lengths. Now, as it relates to the industrially produced trans fat, the trans fatty acid that we used for our determination is ellatic acid, which is most commonly produced through hydrogenation. So that's the trans fat that we used. And for the determination of our saturated fat content, we looked at total saturated fats. Now, for the classification system, we utilize the UK NHS threshold of greater than 17.5 grams per 100 gram, which would indicate high fat or high total fat. We also use the same guidelines for saturated fat. About 5 grams per 100 gram of food sample would be high. And for the PHO limit, less than 2% would be ideal. Above 2% would have gone over the limit. Now, with that being said, here's the fun part, the results. So let's dive in. So we were able to take a look at 308 food products. 45% were from Jamaica as provided by the label's manufacturer, followed by the United States, Trinidad, Thailand, Malaysia, and other countries. So we'll begin with the total fat. Now, what we found was that for our high fat containing foods of cooking oils were number one, followed by spreads, condiments, infant foods, and snacks. Now, when compared to other studies, what we found is that for the most part, they were similar in terms of the distribution of groupings and the amount of samples within each grouping, which would have surpassed the threshold of being considered high fat. Now, from that, we looked into our industrially produced trans fats. Now, what you're noticing now is that of the confectionery group, around 89% had industrially produced trans fats at varying levels, followed by condiments, cooking oils, snacks, and desserts. Now, when we moved to our PHO threshold, what we found was that canned meat had around 75% of that sample that had in excess of the threshold of industrially produced trans fats, followed by dairy, baked goods, and fast foods. Now, this was different when we looked at other studies in other countries, where the dessert items, the spreads, were found to have the highest amounts of industrially produced trans fats that were over the PHO limit. Now, I placed this table here in particular to point out an important aspect, which Professor Samuels also mentioned in her presentation, and that has to do with oil. So where we have that category of cooking oils, you'll realize that coconut oil had a very high amount of trans fat. And in this case, IP trans fat. Now, you're not supposed to find IP trans fat or industrially produced trans fats in coconut oils, right? Now, as Professor Samuels alluded to or said in her presentation, when it comes to processing of oils, right, we do not have any producers of oils here in Jamaica, so we import a lot of the crude oil, and that crude oil is further refined when it does get to the island. Now, that now begs the question, is there a mixing of oils prior to the crude oils coming in, or a mixing of oils after? Again, we are not sure, but you should not be finding industrially produced trans fats within your coconut oils, and at such a very high level. Now, when we looked at saturated fats, the cooking oils had the highest, or were considered high, according to the UK NHS threshold, followed by spreads and condiments. Again, it was a little different when we compared it to other studies, which had spreads and dessert items having the highest. We also combined both to give more of a holistic perspective. And what you're realizing is we do have food categories that have both, which are in excess of the various thresholds. And then you'll also realize as well that even if the food item may not have IP trans fat in very high amounts based on the categories, we also have an issue of having very high saturated fat content. Now, with that information available, we then compared that to the food labels. And of the 308 items, food products, I should say, that we looked at, 175 items had trans fat listed on the label. Now, of that 175, 168 labeled trans fat as being 0, and about 7 items, or 4%, had a value that was greater than 0. Now, what we found was that of that 168, the values that were listed were not entirely accurate, because take into consideration this label of a corned beef, and you'll realize that the manufacturers had labeled 0 trans fat. But on the chromatograph you're seeing here, the arrow that you're seeing being pointed to the peak, that peak is indicative of an industrially produced trans fat. And in this case, this particular brand of corned beef had around 2.35 grams of industrially produced trans fat, which is in excess of the PHO limit. Now, of the labels that listed trans fat as being 0, 104 samples actually tested positive for trans fat. So even though 168 food products listed trans fat as 0, 104 of that 168 actually contained trans fats at varying levels. Now, with all that information being taken into consideration, overall, 1/3 of consumed products that we found contain industrially produced trans fats. 7.8% exceeded the limits set by the Pan American Health Organization, and 32.5% were considered high saturated fat according to the National Health Service threshold. And with that being said, thank you so much for my presentation for today. I just want to leave you with future research and policy implications. So again, we're pushing for further research within the environment, having an educational strategy, reformulation, and a ban on industrially produced trans fats. And we would like to give thanks to all our partners, the University of the West Indies Food and Nutrition Project, funded by IDRC Canada, Resolve to Save Lives, the National Health Fund, and the University of Technology Jamaica. With that being said, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rashid. That was excellent. And as I mentioned earlier, there is very little data on TFA and the food supply in the Caribbean. So this is really groundbreaking information, data that we can use to inform our advocacy and to inform policy. So we're now going to move ahead to our next presenter, Ms. Liz Drummond from Resolve to Save Lives. Liz, we're delighted to have you. We can see you. Can't hear you yet.
Of course, I'm muted. So
Okay.
I learned how to get that one right. Thank you so much for having me. And thanks to all the great presenters. It's really interesting to hear. And thank you, Rashid, for the presentation. I'd love to chat to you more about the data you collected, because it's very rare that we find not many countries have available data on trans fat in the food supply. So I'd love to follow up with you after. But again, thanks so much. I'm just getting my slides up. Can you see the correct view, or can you see mine?
We can see the correct view.
Okay,
Go
great.
Thanks.
Find it confusing. Great. So thanks again for having me and for this great opportunity. I'm Liz Drummond. I'm the trans fat advisor at an organization called Resolve to Save Lives, and we're the very happy the donor for HCC on this activity. And we've also been working very closely with PHO over the past 5 or 6 years on trans fat elimination. We, as an organization founded by Dr. Tom Frieden, the former head of US CDC, we have 2 broad health priorities, one on preventing epidemics and one on saving lives from preventing cardiovascular deaths. And we kind of achieve this through 3 priority areas and 2 priority food policies, one being trans fat elimination and the other being sodium reduction. Again, very top line, just to kind of bring us back to why we talk about eliminating industrial trans fat. It's because it's unneeded and it's added to our foods. It's been kind of attributed to around or more than 500,000 deaths per year. And we know that it's cost effective, saves lives, and has proven to be very feasible for industry. They're doing this in many countries. And I think importantly to note that eliminating industrial trans fat would in fact eliminate an NCD risk factor, which would be the first kind of type of risk factor that could be eliminated. So it's really, like an achievable goal, we feel. And so our organization's approach to eliminating trans fat has been to work very closely with the World Health Organization on this global initiative called Replace, which was kicked off in 2018. And WHO started and launched this initiative to eliminate trans fat from the food supply by providing governments and partners supportive tools to kind of go through this process. And we've been working with them and our global partners to work through this sort of Replace package that's been developed to sort of step-by-step process that takes us through landscaping, research, analysis, designing a regulation, introducing a regulation, and then enforcing that regulation. And we've supported countries across the world in kind of different capacities to achieve this goal, and providing supportive activities around lab capacity, regulatory capacity, and other research needs. So since the start of the trans fat elimination movement in around 2018, we've had great success. The slide's a little busy, but the key takeaways are that since 2018, we've had around 44 countries adopt best practice policies since the launch of the initiative, and that's been achieved with WHO, with PHO, Resolve to Save Lives, and our 2 global partners, GHAI and the NCD Alliance. Some of the biggest wins we've had recently include Mexico, Nigeria, Sri Lanka, India, and Bangladesh and the Philippines, all middle-income countries who passed policies kind of since about 2021 as a result of our global partnership. And earlier on in 2019, we had PHO, as you probably are all familiar, kind of all the member states committed to this committed to a TFA Free Americas. And in that same year, we had the EU was the first regional bloc to adopt a binding policy. So 23 of the EU member states adopted a regional standard, so that eliminated trans fat across the entire EU, which was sort of a real watershed moment for us and for the movement. I'm watching the clock, so I'll hurry ahead. There are 2 main paths to elimination. I think we've touched on these kind of in the various presentations, but there are 2 approaches to eliminating industrially produced trans fat. One is to set a limit on the amount of trans fat that's allowed in foods, and that's 2 grams per 100 grams of total fat in all foods, or the use of a partially hydrogenated oil ban, which limits the production, use, sale, and import of PHO as a food ingredient. These WHO considers these both good options. They meet the same goal, and they kind of both meet the best practice standard. Interestingly, countries recently have actually been adopting a hybrid, which is both models, both options as another way to kind of really bolster those approaches. But those are the two best practice standards that we advocate for. And again, just as a summary to show the kind of the global progress we've had, 44 countries since 2018, and now almost 50% of the world's population, including those countries that passed beforehand, have passed best practice policies. 47 countries of the total class of countries have adopted the 2% limit, and another 6 have used a PHO ban. And then there's 5 countries who have taken this hybrid approach, and Mexico actually took a hybrid approach, which they're now in the planning stages for implementation. So it is sort of becoming increasingly popular. I think in the countries that have moved recently, most of them have adopted a hybrid policy. Coming more closely to Latin America and the Caribbean, and I know we heard earlier that no Caribbean countries have adopted a best practice standard, but broadly, the region of the Americas and PHO have really been kind of one of the standouts in the global movement for elimination. I think the region as a whole has reached its sort of new elimination target of over 90% of the burden. And that's, because countries like Canada, United States, Mexico, Argentina, Brazil, and Peru have all adopted those policies. And for those countries where there's new or more recent policies like Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil, the focus now is on making sure that those policies are really implemented and that countries are enforcing these bans. Looking more closely at the progress in the region, just to kind of highlight what the policy options have been used are. In Chile, which was one of the first countries in the world to adopt a policy, kind of as they have been at the forefront of many of these food policies, in 2009, they used a 2% limit. And then you can see that Peru, Uruguay, Brazil, Paraguay, and Argentina all similarly adopted that 2% limit. And Mexico has a hybrid that they adopted recently. 2 countries have less restrictive limits. So that's where we have there'll be a limit in certain food categories. So in Ecuador, the trans fat limit only applies to fats and oils. And in Colombia, they have one limit for one category of food and then one for another. And as you would have seen from Rashid's presentation, it doesn't help just to focus on fats and oils because there is trans fat in other food categories. So by kind of having this mixed limit, it doesn't meet our standard and doesn't kind of then remove trans fat from the food supply adequately. Then a number of countries also have what WHO terms other complementary measures, which don't really, they're kind of helpful, but they don't go all the way to eliminating or kind of reducing trans fat consumption to a significant degree. So Bolivia has mandatory declaration of TFA on labels. In Venezuela, they have sort of some front of pack labeling activities. And in Costa Rica, they have trans fat limits in specific settings, I believe at schools. And I think there's actually a similar policy in Barbados, but the details are kind of murky on WHO's tracker. So in terms of the coverage gaps for trans fat kind of globally, but again, obviously in the region, we know that most progress to date has really been in these high income countries, though there is increasing adoption in middle income countries, both upper and lower middle income. To date, no low income countries have adopted a best practice policy, despite the fact that we know the evidence shows that trans fat elimination is a best buy for NCD prevention across all economic contexts. And no SIDS, with the exception of Singapore, have adopted a policy. Guam and Northern Mariana Islands, but they are kind of, I guess, their own kind of type of governance. So only Singapore in the category of SIDS countries. And in terms of how we achieve that policy passage and what is the mechanism for adoption, most countries have actually, in our experience, used a regulatory approach to introducing a limit, as opposed to a legislative approach, through a parliamentary avenue. So the vast majority of countries have had like an FDA introduce a regulation. Mexico is one of the few countries we've supported that did take a legislative pathway. That was because they sort of felt that this was the most efficient and they had a lot of commitment from parliamentarians. So that is sort of one thing we've seen. However, in countries should choose what is the best option for them and what makes the most sense politically. But we have found that using a regulatory approach has often been faster and more efficient, and certainly just as legally binding as a legislative approach. And our L module in the replace package actually provides some detail on that, and also really has really great guidance on identifying what is the best policy option for each country. Particularly where you rely on imports, a PHO ban may be the best option. However, when there are large, there is like local refinement, a TFA limit may be more appropriate, but there is really clear guidance on that in our materials. One thing Maisha asked me to speak to was really the role of CSOs, and this is something that Resolve to Save Lives and our partners have been kind of closely supporting since we started this work. All our policy success to date has been nearly all our policy success to date has been in countries where we've had a really active civil society engagement. And we know that civil society is essential in moving food policy, and the elimination of TFA is no different. We've been supporting CSOs across the globe in the Caribbean, Latin America, South Asia, in Africa and East Asia. And to date, they've all been incredibly successful and powerful. And really instrumental to some of the success, particularly in Mexico and the success we had in Brazil and Argentina. CSOs have been involved in research on advocacy, research on TFA and the food supply, similar to what Rashid presented. Media campaigns have been really essential, journalist trainings and media activities, so keeping trans fat kind of alive and well in the public discussion and at front of minds. Stakeholder and policy mapping, sort of the bread and butter of advocacy activities, and a lot of direct stakeholder advocacy and engagement. A lot of our CSOs have been providing direct technical assistance to government on drafting and kind of also providing scientific support and advice, helping with conducting analysis or capacity building activities, and also doing a lot of media attention around public consultations. So in countries where there's a public consultation program process for the regulatory activities, CSOs have been really instrumental in making sure that the public is aware and kind of making their voice known, but also protecting that from industry influence as well, which has really been crucial. As just some examples of things that our partners have done, in Pakistan, one of our partners was really instrumental in collecting data. The government sort of said, we don't want to move ahead with a regulation until we have better data, even though there was already sort of existing actually good quality data, which is quite rare. And so our partner did the analysis, did the survey, actually invested and provided support for a lab to run the analysis as well. So not only invested in doing the analysis, but building the capacity. And the result was that the government, once they had that, they said, okay, great, we've got the evidence, we need to go ahead. And last year they passed a policy. Unfortunately, it wasn't a best practice policy, but it was a significant improvement on what was in place. And since then, they've actually been working towards upgrading the policy from kind of that almost best practice to not best practice. I think my slide accidentally jumped ahead. And then just as another example, our Nigerian CSOs, where we had a policy win, were very active in, engaging the government and keeping the process moving. It was a long-running campaign, and we had a number of CSOs involved, and they were very instrumental in making sure the government was on track, participating in the process, the consultation processes, gathering interest, making sure that the feedback was sort of being incorporated. And now, as they move forward into the implementation, are supporting the government with their implementation plans and capacity building again on enforcement and monitoring. And as we know, CSOs can play a really, really critical role in protecting from industry influence. In the Philippines, there was quite a heavy, as you might imagine, kind of heavy influence from the coconut and palm industries. And so our CSO partners were kind of able to protect the regulatory process and discussions from their interests. Even though palm and coconut are not products that naturally contain trans fat, I think that they were sort of interested in making sure that we weren't kind of going to affect their business interests. So it was quite a significant role, and we managed to move ahead with a policy and kind of keep the industry out in the Philippines. Generally speaking, we know that trusted local CSOs can be pivotal in generating interest and support amongst government and push ahead this policy process while also building that public support and commitment for these important food policies, such as the work being done by HCC in the Caribbean. And then just more broadly, I think just to zoom out and say like what has been instrumental at the global level, it's been kind of this global support and global partnership with multiple partners engaged at global and regional and now at country level. That coalition of support has been really essential for the success to date, kind of across the board. Another thing that we've learned is that government usually wants data. It's very rare that we work in a country and they say, oh, we'll move ahead without evidence, but it is hard to get and it's expensive to collect. So we have been able to kind of be persuasive with evidence around cost effectiveness and the benefit of preventing future harms. The timeline for adoption, we think it's around 2 years. It's sometimes longer, it's sometimes shorter, but we have found that that's probably around how much time is needed. And again, as I mentioned earlier, that the regulatory approach rather than legislative tends to be a little faster. But again, and we really do see that the support from the CSOs and advocates is key in pushing government to make those critical steps and really be engaged in the process. And I believe my time is up, so I will stop there. I do apologize for speaking so fast, but please feel free to reach out directly or share any questions in the chat and I'm happy to answer them. But thanks again for your time. It was great to have the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Liz, and sorry that you had to rush through that. We did have quite a packed agenda, but I think everyone has a greater appreciation now for the work that Resolve is doing globally. And the work that civil society, the contributions they're making to TFA legislation in so many different geographies. So we're going to shift now to back to the Caribbean, and I'm going to invite Cheryl Dennis-Wright. She's going to talk about pathways to TFA regulation in our region. Cheryl, go ahead and you can turn your camera on. I'll make sure that we can see you and we can hear you. Great, we can see you. Welcome. Your audio, you need to unmute.
Oh, my apologies.
There we go.
Away. Good morning and good morning to everyone. I'm happy to be a part of this discussion. So let me know when you are able to see my screen.
Okay, we can see you, not your slides yet.
Can you see it?
Not yet.
Oh, wow, what's happening here? Okay, let me.
They're not up yet. So you're sharing from your end?
I'm sharing from I did not. Let me see now. Share my screen. Are you able
it's coming up. Yeah, it's coming.
You're able to see the screen?
Perfect. Just into presenter mode and then you're good to go.
Great.
Perfect. Thank you.
I don't know. All of this excitement is happening on my screen. All right, so good morning again. I commend the earlier speakers because as much as we think we know everything, we've been in this landscape, there is always an opportunity to learn. And I was there thoroughly delving in while Liz was presenting. So let me move right ahead. As Maisha mentioned, I'm going to look at the CARICOM commitments and also from our regional landscape, the countries that are moving ahead as well as the regulatory pathways. And Liz would have spoken to some of these regulatory pathways generally in other countries. So just as a matter of disclosure, the information that I'll be presenting comes from the report on the landscape analysis for the regulation of iTFAs. And of course, this was based on the sponsorship of Resolve to Save Lives, so HCC, and HCC had contracted the researchers, STW Consulting Company. So the information is really from that report. Now, as we look at regulatory pathways, it's important that as we consider moving the region ahead in terms of legislative development or even policy development, it's important for us to always have regard to what our international commitments are, especially as it relates to our global strategies. So not just international commitments, but global strategies. And one important aspect of that is the Constitution of the World Health Organization, which calls upon states and whereby states have agreed to regard health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. Now, I recognize, even in terms of the policy landscape and in terms of policy development, it's always important for us to draw on instruments and to draw on commitments, because this is what not only signals commitments that were made earlier, but also pulls on those who are a part of the policy environment to recall what was done in the past and to recall and to also understand where they're going. In terms of the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, one country or another may always have regard to the fact that it makes provision for the adequate supply of safe food and nutrition. Always useful to also draw on the Convention on the Rights of the Child, by which states recognize the right of the child to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health. And in particular, CRC General Comment on the Right to Health under Article 4 is always good to draw on. So as we seek to put our policies in place, always, it's important to draw on these international commitments and global strategies. Another part of that is the report of the 2023 UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Everyone, which speaks to the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. Very, very important for us to draw on. Also, the Sustainable Development Goals, we can't reiterate it too often. And another strategy is the PHO Plan of Action for the Elimination of iTFAs, which speaks to the full scaling up of the adoption and implementation of iTFA elimination policies throughout the Americas. As a part of the policy development process, we also want to recognize the fact that there is a WHO plan to eliminate iTFAs, industrially produced trans fatty acids, from the global food supplies. And you've heard of it. It was mentioned earlier as the replace package. I believe Professor Samuel spoke about it. Perhaps Rashid mentioned it, and I believe also Liz mentioned it, so I won't go into the details. But bearing in mind that it calls on governments to use the replace action package to eliminate iTFAs. Also, the PHO Rio Declaration for a trans fat-free Americas. It's important that we make, we also allude to these. Now, why am I mentioning these commitments or these, international strategies? Again, it's important that as we seek to put in place our policies, we have regard to the fact that our governments have already been challenged. Not only have they been challenged, they have also committed. And apart from their commitment, there are some global strategies that will help countries to meet these commitments. Now, one such regional commitment is the CARICOM Port of Spain Declaration. And I'm sure if I were to ask by show of hands or for persons to mention in the chat, many of you, perhaps 90 to 100% of you, have heard of the CARICOM Port of Spain Declaration. We've alluded to it in so many of our discussions. Again, it signals the commitment of government leaders to unite with a view to ending the epidemic of chronic NCDs. We've had from that the fourth iteration of the CARICOM Cooperation in Health, and more recently, the Bridgetown Declaration on NCDs and mental health in SIDS. Now, although this is not specific to the Caribbean, of course, it took place in the Caribbean last year. And again, our governments, our leaders had a fresh opportunity to make a recommitment. So as you seek to put in place policies, again, it's important that we make mention of this. The quoted COSAT decision, it was mentioned, I believe Professor Samuels had an identical slide. So again, I will not go into it, but it's important for us as we seek to put in place policies, legislation, to remind our leaders, to remind those in the policy space of this important commitment of the Council of Trade and Economic Development, and also the COSAT in terms of the decision where they agreed to work toward the prohibition of iTFAs. There was not only the agreement, there was a commitment for this to be put in place in terms of a prohibition by the 31st of December 2023, but no later than 2024. And then the mandate, to ensure that there is the elimination by December 31st, 2025. Now, this slide really shows the CARICOM commitments in respect of trans fats throughout the years. And as there was a mention that was made in respect of the WHO regional drafting tool and some best practices. And To go into the replace package just somewhat, it speaks to the reviewing of dietary supplies, the promoting of the replacement of IPTFAs or iTFAs, to legislate or enact regulatory actions to eliminate iTFAs. And Liz just mentioned, that it's much easier to put in place policy. And I can agree that in the Caribbean, it's a lot less bureaucratic. However, in terms of legislation, we still want to pull on government to go all the way. The A for assess and monitor, C for create awareness, which is one of the reasons we're also having this webinar, and E for enforcing compliance with policies and strategies. So in terms of the PHO regulator drafting tool, it proposes 3 best practice approaches and options to eliminate TFAs. It speaks to the PHO ban, the 2% TFA limit, and the combination of the 2 policies. And you will see the detail in terms of the breakdown from a regulatory perspective in terms of the easiest way to eliminate iTFAs. And what is proposed in terms of this regulatory drafting tool is that by adding PHOs to a list of prohibited substances that are deemed unsafe for human consumption, that is one way in which, under legislation, steps can be taken to ensure that we are effectively regulating this particular additive. Another strategy is to remove from the list of substances deemed safe for human consumption. This is something that can also be done legislatively. And alternatively, the list of substances could be amended to prohibit more than 2 grams. And you have the breakdown there. Now, to go a little bit into the regulatory landscape in the Caribbean, as it was said before, presently there is no CARICOM country that has national legislation or regulation eliminating PHOs from the food supply or limiting iTFA content to no more than 2% of the total fat in all food products. If you are to look at, or I invite you therefore to take a look at this, just bear in mind, we are not saying who is ahead. This whole race in terms of how far we go or how quickly we go, it looks like a sprint, but it's not a sprint, it's really a marathon. So if you take into consideration where we're going with TFAs, it remains the same, not a sprint, but a marathon. So I leave it to your judgment to determine who seems to be advancing in the race. Notwithstanding, some competition is healthy. So let us strive to move our countries ahead. Now, this slide shows the regulatory process in the target countries that were featured in the report that I mentioned earlier. And I know it looks a little bit complicated. However, the regulatory process is really, or can be moved by virtue of political will. So what channels you go to or what channels you go through, how quickly you run or move would depend on whether or not you're putting in place policy or whether or not you're putting in place legislation. And again, political will can move it much faster. We've seen that a number of countries, and this slide speaks to Antigua, coming down, this slide speaks to Antigua and Barbuda, which was not one of the featured countries, but was included for comparative analysis. So it speaks to some pieces of legislation under which we have or we can have legislative entry points. The Bahamas, there's a Food Safety and Quality Act. Also in the Bahamas, there has been some policy initiatives through their national compulsory standards for healthy lunch meals. In Barbados, there are several pieces of legislation through which there are legislative entry points. We have also seen that there are some policy initiatives that were taken or that has taken place. Similarly, in Jamaica, several pieces of legislation that may be amended to treat with iTFAs and the elimination. And again, outside of their legislative landscape, there are some policy initiatives, and this slide just indicates some of the health promotion activities. St. Kitts and Nevis, their legislative landscape also allows for amendments, and also St. Lucia, so I've completed the countries. So just to complete or to conclude, entry points do exist in all the countries, notwithstanding the ones that were featured in the report, for amendments to their legislation via the definitions, the introductory of mandatory nutrition labels, via the list of adulterated or prohibited food, the introduction of import licenses, and also there is a need, once you're going to be putting in place policies, for you to include penalties to address designated breaches. Of course, one fundamental aspect of putting in place legislation is consultation with all the stakeholders, not to leave out civil society. And there are a few recommended actions. Some were spoken of by the previous presenters, and I know the ones to come will also elaborate. Thank you very much. Over to you, Maisha.
Thank you, Cheryl. So we have the regulatory pathways mapped out, which is extremely useful guidance for the countries as they seek to implement their commitments to the 2025 deadline. We're going to, in recognition of World Hypertension Day today, invite Dr. Gloria Giraldo to share with us more about the better care for NCDs and the Hearts Initiative in the Caribbean.
Hi, thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to present on some ideas that complement today's topic on trans fat elimination with a broader view to addressing NCDs. From PHO, we understand clearly that addressing NCDs needs to be a multi-pronged approach with a systems perspective. That is why I'd like to take the opportunity to carve out a few minutes to zoom out of the much needed focus on trans fat elimination to an overall system strengthening view. So let's start by talking about PHO's new initiative called Better Care for NCDs, Accelerated Actions in Primary Healthcare. And I like to remind us all of a foundational definition, that of primary healthcare, which is a whole of society approach to effectively organize, strengthen national health systems to bring services for health and well-being closer to communities. And it has three main components: integrated health services, addressing broader determinants of health through multi-sectoral policy and action, which is what we are doing today to this focus on trans fat elimination. And third, empowering individuals, families, and communities to take charge of their own health. So the Better Care for NCDs aims to strengthen the capacity of health authorities to plan and implement this integrative approach. It also aims to increase the capacity of health services to deliver comprehensive quality screening, diagnosis, treatment, and follow-up, and to strengthen data collection and monitoring. And if you see by the illustration, we're looking at the different non-communicable diseases, or the major non-communicable diseases, on which we already work on along with all of you. The initiative will have a multidisciplinary approach with 6 areas of work, scaling up areas such as hearts, for example, or cervical cancer elimination. It has to strengthen community outreach, normative NCD guidance, and quality of NCD care improvement, primary healthcare workforce development, expansion of NCD medicines and technologies, and the improvement of NCDs and monitoring. But I also like to see the larger picture, which this overall guiding for primary healthcare assessment and planning allows us to see. This framework organizes the 3 primary healthcare components along 14 levers. It's a bit complicated. You can visit, you can obtain this information in the WHO page on primary healthcare. However, here, I just wanted to call your attention of why we're looking at it together. If we look here on the left-hand side on the red rectangle, any health systems approach looks at its determinants, and one of them is structure, and within it is governance. We have governance policy frameworks, and within that, multi-sectorial policy and action. That is where trans fat elimination fits in. But on the right-hand side, we also have service delivery, and we're focusing on NCD prevention, diagnosis, treatment, rehab, and palliation. Within that service delivery, when we go to the process that need to be in place in order to achieve integrated people-centered care, there are Of course, you will have to design services based on your epidemiology. You have to have systems for improving quality and for creating resilient health services. All of that to get us to better care, ultimately. So the better care for NCDs builds on the work that we have already been doing in the Americas. And some of that work is hopefully well known to all of you. We have been applying the WHO PAHO technical packages. And basically, as you know, a technical package really focuses on high priority evidence-based intervention that together will have the greatest impact. And on the left-hand side here, we can see those population-based approaches such as Empower, Active, Shake, Safer, and today's focus, which has been replaced. On the right-hand side, we have the health services or clinical approach package, solidly based on the chronic care model. Basically, the HEARTS initiative has operationalized the chronic care model. And with that, we are able to take a condition such as hypertension, which has consequences on multimorbidities, and because of its highly systemic nature. We know that hypertension is a major cause of stroke, of heart failure, and among the major causes of kidney disease. Thus, if we're able to impact hypertension, there'll be a whole domino effect in impacting positively all other NCDs. And we know we have a high prevalence of hypertension, not only globally, not only in our region of the Americas, but very much here in the Caribbean. So the impetus of HEARTS has been to how do we change this picture? This the hypertension treatment cascade, very basically, on red, we see all the people in our communities that are undiagnosed. They're walking in our communities without knowing they have hypertension. And our purpose is to get and to whiten, to lengthen that dark green, which means that these are people living healthy lives, even with hypertension, because they have hypertension under control. Without interventions, we know that not only the incidence, the prevalence will continue to grow, and it will continue to impact the whole spectrum of NCDs. And because we are today, May 17th, observing Hypertension World Day, I'd like to bring us back to what is it that we currently do. We tell patients how to reduce the risk of hypertension, reduce salt intake, eat fresh natural foods, engage in regular physical activity. But we know that those behaviors are completely conditioned by the environments in which we live. Therefore, when we look at the food environment, like we are doing today, and eliminating trans fats has everything to do with NCDs. So that's one arm of the equation. The entire risk factors. We know that the WHO has put out now for a number of years the best buys, which are the best cost-effective interventions. And this is the scorecard for the Caribbean, and we have a lot of work to do. However, I want to emphasize that by working in tandem, both in terms of upstream and downstream interventions, that's the only way we're going to get a handle on the NCDs. And I love to bring this work, which has been conducted by Caribbean researchers, and we have some of them with us today, because it shows conditions that are so closely linked, diabetes, obesity, with data from the Caribbean, showing that through a system dynamic simulation, that only intensive upstream and downstream interventions can curb our current NCD epidemic. And when we talk about upstream, of course, we have trans fat elimination, packaged nutrition labeling, And we have HARTS to on the downstream aspect. Currently, 33 countries are implementing HARTS. Out of those 33, 17 countries and territories are in the Caribbean. And they're already showing some improvement, showing that 60% of people that are under a standardized treatment program in HARTS implementing countries are reaching up to 60% of control of hypertension. Thus, HARTS has been a game changer. It has shown very concretely what can be done to standardize and simplify interventions that will actually result in positive clinical outcomes. And today, I want to leave you with the idea that the initiative of Better Care for NCDs is building solidly on the platform that has been built through the HARTS initiative. And we love to continue working with you in tandem on the upstream and all the policy-related work, as well as the downstream, such as the Better Care for NCDs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gloria. That was very informative. We're now going to move to our panel discussion, and I'm going to invite our moderator, Professor Samuels, as well as our panelists, Kaj Archer from the Healthy Bahamas Coalition, Brian Payne from the Ministry of Health and Wellness in Barbados, Dr. Victor Villalobos Daniel from PHO, and Michelle Baker from Lake Health and Wellbeing in St. Kitts to turn on your cameras. And over to you, Alafia.
Thank you very much, Maisha. I think we've had a very good session so far. And now I wanted to put some people on the spot, asking some direct questions. So let me start with Ms. Archer or Mr. Payne. Barbados and Bahamas have indicated strong political commitments to regulation or elimination of industrially produced trans fats. Can you share with us where you are right now in your respective countries? What is the status of the regulation? What public education are you planning to do, and any challenges that you see coming up? Ms. Archer, you want to start?
Sure. Okay, so first of all, thank you for having me here today. I think this is such an important topic for our region as we aim to create healthier populations within our respective countries. So in terms of where the Bahamas is with iTFA regulation, the Ministry of Health and Wellness recognizes the crucial need for legislation and policies that limit the presence of iTFAs within the food supply. And so presently, the ministry is considering legislation that will set mandatory limits on iTFAs. And these limits will align with the recommended less than 2 grams of iTFA per 100 grams of total fatty acids. However, before introducing the legislation, we will conduct sensitization campaigns to educate the Bahamian public on iTFAs, specifically what they are, how they're made, how to distinguish them from ruminant or naturally occurring TFAs, the potential health impacts, including the potential increased risk of cardiovascular diseases, and the healthier alternatives. So these campaigns will be developed in collaboration with the ministry's communications department to ensure that they are comprehensive and effectively targeted to reach and inform our desired audiences. In terms of legislation, as with any legislation or overarching policy, there's going to be some challenges or pushback. So within the first few years of implementation, if the legislation is passed, we do anticipate some pushback from local restaurants and food retailers. So monitoring and enforcement will be critical in the initial years of implementation. Politically, we expect some resistance, but overall minimal to medium pushback, since our largest trading partner, the United States, has already banned PHOs. And so this will help to support our argument that we should also limit TFAs or ban PHOs within our context. So Yeah, that's currently where we are in the Bahamas. We do anticipate some challenges in terms of testing as well, due to limited testing capacity. And so we may have to outsource testing for that purpose, but that is currently where we are.
Okay, thank you very much. And Mr. Payne, Barbados, are you more advanced than the Bahamas? We have a little horse race going on here.
Yeah, I think we're pretty far ahead. I think, as Bahamas cited, I think there are some challenges here with testing. I think we've received assurances from the government lab here that they will be ready and rearing to go as it relates to testing of industrially produced trans fatty acids. Our deadline, the deadline given by the Ministry of Health and Wellness, would be the end of this year, 2024, and we expect to enforce. We expect to fully enforce the legislation by December 2025, and I think that's key. The Ministry of Health and Wellness and the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security are looking to enact new legislation. The legislation is currently in draft and not in the public domain as yet, but the legislation which governs food safety is currently being drafted, or has been drafted and is currently being discussion, but again, is not in the public domain. And again, the key thing here is that we want to put a ban on industrialized produced trans fatty acids and also partially hydrogenated oils. Again, like Bahamas, I think our biggest trading partner would be the US. And I think they would have banned the industrially produced trans fatty acids. So I guess that's a good thing for us as well too. As it relates to a broader scope for the banning of industrially produced trans fatty acids, I mean, we have several campaigns currently going on to educate the public about the harmful benefits of the harmful effects of trans fatty acids. So we're working closely with the National NCD Commission and other entities to educate the public.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Villalobos, I want to ask you about testing and to just reflect on the fact that Mr. Perry's presentation earlier showed us that the majority of foods tested in Jamaica that had trans fat had a label that says 0 trans fat. Now, is it because the manufacturers knew that we could not test? Or is this a quote unquote honest mistake? But the issue of testing obviously is critical because if you can't validate, then anybody can put anything on a label. Now, what is the implication for the status of our testing capacity in the Caribbean for the implementation of any ban on trans fats?
Well, thank you, all of you. And I think the presentations I saw were amazing. We were there in March, and now I see so much progress. There is so much expertise and data in the region. And this point that you highlight, shall we consider this a mistake or an purpose lie in the food labeling? First, we need to look at the regulation to be sure that there is no rounding issues. There is a famous story in nutritional policy that says that when the United States ask the food labeling to estimate trans fat, not rounded to 0 grams, but to estimate more accurately what was the amount of trans fatty acids, suddenly all the companies were able to reformulate. Because they were claiming to be trans fat free, they were claiming to have 0 grams per portion of trans fat. And then when the rounding rule changed and they had to point it to 1 decimal, suddenly they say, wow, we need to reformulate. Can we do it in 2 months, in 3 months? Okay, we will do it. Because it was already a stigma to have trans fat. So let's have first a look at the regulation. Some countries are asking for a regulation that is in milligrams, like cholesterol. The codex states it can be in grams with 1 decimal, or you can ask for 2 decimals. After that, then we need to have some enforcement mechanisms in place.
I think that's
Yep. And then this is the point where we can use something called chain of trust. You can ask each importer of foods.
Accumulates. And so if you don't round, you can end up with very high levels.
Exactly. Exactly. You will have to declare the amount that the product has.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So the first concept is chain of trust. When you have an importer of foods coming from another country, you can ask the importer to show the proof that the producer is stating that food is trans fat free, at least from industrially produced ones. And if you're importing ingredients, the same. In your regulation, in your country, you can also do it. Let's say that there is in Barbados a spreading manufacture. They are using raw ingredients. You can ask them, okay, what is the proof that your ingredients are trans fat free? You can ask the producer to certify that they are not using partially hydrogenated oils, or if it is the case that they are doing in-house heating of the oils, that there is a certification is not going above the limits stated in the future regulation. The other issue, I'm not sure, Alafia, if I should talk about the difference between ruminant and industrially produced trans fats.
Well, I mean, I think that we all recognize that the ruminant trans fat is there. It's in very low levels, and that's really not our focus. It's the industrialized ones that is killing us, really, in the Caribbean in particular, in the Caribbean, with our very high premature mortality from heart attack and stroke, and our very high consumption of foods that are obviously high in trans fat. So we have a lot of work to do.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you very much for your answer. I hope Cheryl Dennis, I hope you have taken note of the fact that we don't want to round. We want to have at least 0.5 or 0.4, whatever the number is, because as we are hearing, this is a great motivator for reformulation, which is what we need. So.
Oh, yes, definitely.
Yes, Cheryl, good, thank you. Ms. Baker, what lessons learned from your food policy advocacy in other areas can be applied to this program around industrially produced trans fats in St. Kitts and Nevis?
Thank you, and I'm happy to be here. My name is Michelle Baker. I serve as the Advocacy and Research Officer of Lake Health and Wellbeing here in St. Kitts and Nevis. And it's one of our greatest successes, our Sweet Enough, Your Sweet Enough campaign. So our Your Sweet Enough campaign is aimed to educate the public about health risk associated with sugar-sweetened beverages and to advocate for an SSB tax on sugary drinks. So we've obviously learned many lessons over the years, but here are a few that first came to mind. So number one, the importance of building public awareness and knowledge about public health and policy issues and ensuring that this message is culturally appropriate. So for example, we ensure that all of our content features Kittitian and Nivisian dialects and features persons and characters that of course resemble our community. Number two, consider the health literacy and readability of your target group. So we found it useful to employ short form content with clear, direct messaging that considers health literacy and readability. For example, when we noticed that many people were unaware of even what an NCD is in St. Kitts and Nevis, we established a segment called Michelle's Minute, where I was challenged to explain a common question in less than 1 minute. And so this was really aimed to get the information out there in a very short way, in a very simple way.
I like that. Michelle's Minute. I like that.
Thank you. Number three, the importance of evaluating what is effective for your specific target population. So for example, many people, including myself, assumed that social media would have the greatest reach here in St. Kitts and Nevis. However, after the first phase of our Your Sweet Enough project, we distributed a survey, and the results actually revealed that most people who encountered our campaign were introduced via the radio. So it is very important to pause and assess if you should change direction or if you should continue with the path you originally planned. So what is actually working along the way of your advocacy plan? Another lesson was building strong coalitions. So we recently moved to establish our St. Kitts and Nevis Entity Alliance. And this is a collaboration with other NGOs in the Federation that has amplified our voice when approaching policymakers and regional partners. So obviously, the more the merrier, the more the impact. Next, the power of nurturing and building meaningful relationships with key stakeholders. So oftentimes we might approach stakeholders with what we want, what we're asking for, what are our demands. And so something to keep in mind and something we have learned is keeping in mind not only what we're asking for from our stakeholders and partners, but we must also think about how we can support them to build mutually beneficial relationships. Last 2 points, the need for evidence and dissemination of research to strengthen messaging. So I can say from personal experience, even just last year, that you can expect to be challenged, right? You can expect to be challenged to provide research on the spot, even in a public forum, or challenged on the strength of the body of research available. So it's always important to share evidence, to share research, and to prepare for rebuttals and attempts to undermine. And last, but certainly not least, is the importance of meaningfully engaging young people from the outset. And this is particularly important to me. I am proud to share that at Lake Health and Wellbeing, myself, along with our director, Abby Bejo, we created a youth health advocates program to encourage youth leadership in public health advocacy here in St. Kitts. I myself am also a proud member of the Healthy Caribbean Youth, a subgroup of Healthy Caribbean Coalition, which consists of young public health advocates across the Caribbean. So this is important because young people, of course, bring a unique perspective. We can appeal to new audiences. We can expand the reach of messaging. And so I just want to, of course, always advocate for us to empower and trust young persons to lead on these pressing health issues that will impact generations to come. So those are just a few. I had to limit them, but these are just a few of the many lessons that we've learned with our Your Sweet Enough project.
Thank you, Michelle. That was very, very useful information for us to have and to take on board as we go forward with the trans fat advocacy. So let me go back now to Barbados and Bahamas and ask the question about your local food industry. Have you engaged with them so far? And if so, how has the response been? What has it been? What are the challenges?
I'll take it first. In terms of, I think the Ministry of Health and Wellness would have engaged industry players roughly about a year or so ago. And industry seemed quite keen to, to meet the deadline of December 2024. But I think the challenge for us has always been our lack of testing capacity. And it really comes down to, it wouldn't be wise to necessarily depend on industry to actually say that their foods are trans fats free, as the research showed today. So we are working with the government analytical lab to ensure they have the resources and the manpower to actually test the products. And of course, we're trying to devise a way to carry out sampling in a very systematic way to test products ourselves. But industry seemed very keen, to kind of jump on board. And issues surrounding reformulation have been discussed, but we will see how things progress as the ban approaches.
Okay, thank you very much. And Bahamas?
Right. So as I would have mentioned, we are still in the preliminary stages as it relates to legislation on iTFA. So we have not yet engaged with the food industry. However, we do anticipate that there will be some resistance from restaurants and local food vendors. And I say this because they may express concerns about the need to reformulate their recipes or to source new supplies or products, which could potentially disrupt their operations. So to address these concerns, we are aiming to provide education on alternative oils and similar products that comply with the recommended iTFA limits we are seeking to impose of the 2 grams of iTFA per 100 grams of total fatty acids. So this approach is intended to help the industry transition smoothly while maintaining the quality and availability of their goods and services. So in terms of timelines, we are looking at a graduated timeline for the implementation of relevant policies. So certain sections of our legislation will come into force on certain dates. That is more so to help smaller businesses so they can have more time to reformulate or to source new products, just because we understand the economic impact this might have on businesses. So we wanted to give them more time and ensure that they are able to comply with the limits that we seek to set out.
Yes, thank you. And to both Barbados and Bahamas and the other countries on the call, I would also be interested in finding out if you have been able to identify the source, the country from which your partially hydrogenated oils are coming. I think that upstream approach could really help the small manufacturers, because if the oil that they get doesn't have PHOs, then they don't have to worry about reformulation. So I would love to encourage that. Dr. Villalobos, PAHO recently released a study, The Economic Impact of Eliminating Industrially Produced Trans Fats in Barbados. Can you share the key findings and how you think this could be used to galvanize support?
Thank you, Dr. Olafia. Well, the main finding is that even though the amount of trans fat in the products was estimated to be low, and I emphasize it's an estimation because we didn't do laboratory analysis, to have it been coming down from compare maybe to 2000, the year 2000, the impact in economic losses for the society is very high. It was to about $500,000 just because there was not a ban on trans fatty acids, industrially produced trans fatty acids in 2019. This is just the impact of 1 year of not having the ban. This is representing productivity losses, and it doesn't include healthcare costs of each cardiovascular event that could be attributed to trans fatty acids. So in terms of cost effectiveness for the society, banning trans fatty acids is very, very efficient.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Just one question, Alafia, one comment.
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm.
That argument that has come up here, I think is very important also for media to mobilize legislators. You know, other countries are exporting partially hydrogenated oils to the Caribbean.
Mm-hmm.
So do we want a region to become a dumping of industrial products that are not allowed in other countries?
Exactly. Exactly. And just on that very point too, one of the things I said to the Jamaica Manufacturers and Exporters Association is that how would it sound if the public knew that America is protecting their people, but the Caribbean is not protecting their people? Caribbean manufacturers are not protecting their people when it is industry standard, right? So I think that in terms of, our focus, the policymakers are very important, and the food industry is very important also. We have to find a way to convince, pressure, encourage, whatever word you want to use, but the food industry is there's a lot of inertia. There's nothing, they're not going to benefit by, reducing trans fat. Their bottom line is not going to make them more profit. So that's not a priority. If it's not profit, it's not a priority for them, unless we make it a priority for them. So I think we should do that. So Ms. Baker, on that note, how can the civil society really engage with the private sector in terms of encouraging them to make the moves necessary on trans fat?
Thank you. So I would definitely say using the approach of, I always try to think when we engage any partner, any person, what's in it for them. And so always try to frame it in a way of what is the benefit for them, what is the responsibility for them, how this could also help to improve their image, their marketing. And so that would be my biggest takeaway from our experience with our campaign. Think about what's in it for the person, regardless of whether it's industry, policymaker, the public think about what's in it for them when you're approaching to ask for whatever it is that you're asking for, and approach it from that viewpoint.
Yes. So maybe we need to really sit down together and think about coming up with a one-pager aimed at industry that is entitled "What's in it for you?" Right?
I like that idea.
Yes. Eliminating trans fat. What's in it for you? Their industry. This is, you know, and a little open, we could even have an open letter and publish that letter in the media. And, you know, as an appeal from the civil society to industry to say, this is how you will benefit. And this is what other countries are doing and that we are not doing for our people. So,
correct.
Yeah, that might be helpful. Okay, so Maisha, do you want me to give you back your time so you can get in a few questions, or
I was thinking, why disrupt your flow, Alethea? I was thinking we could invite Cheryl on and the other panelists on, everyone who's spoken today, turn your cameras on. We did have a question for Cheryl around, you know, why is this such low-hanging fruit? Why is this something that we've seen such movement on when we compare it to other food policies across the globe? And then we'll invite the audience. Please share your questions in the chat or the Q&A. This is the opportunity for you to get those burning questions answered by these experts. Over to you, Cheryl.
Right. So thanks, Maisha, and I'm happy to rejoin this discussion. So TFA regulation is actually far easier to pass than other policies like FOPL and so on. And yes, it's important to keep stakeholders informed. It's important that in terms of ministries, departments, and agencies, we keep them as a part of the discussion. So as I was saying, it's far easier to pass, and therefore, you know, it could really represent a win-win for any political actor. It would, of course, show their strength and their leadership in passing, you know, in the passage of this new legislation or amending the regulations. As I had outlined in my presentation, there are options that are provided in terms of best practice. And for a number of our pieces of legislation in the Caribbean, when that deals with food, there's a section that deals with foods that are adulterated and so on. And it would be easy to amend those particular sections to show or to add, you know, PHOs. There's the alternative that was provided, you know, where we can show foods that are good for consumption. So it's much easier to pass and could therefore represent, as I said before, a win-win.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Now, let me ask, do any of the panelists want to ask a question to another panelist? Gloria. Yes, Gloria, I see you.
Yeah, I think one of the recurring questions that we had it today, but we also see it in terms of this best approach, and it's related to the previous question. Are we really in a position right now to go at this low-hanging fruit as a regional approach, as a regional regulation, or does this always entail necessarily a national approach or a parallel approach? Over.
Well, you know that there is nothing called regional legislation. I mean, that's not a thing. It's independent countries, and each country passes their own legislation. Am I right, Cheryl? She's nodding. Yes, thank you.
Yes, you are correct. And if I'm to pick up from there, countries, I know, for instance, for Jamaica, one example is that at the beginning of the year, there is a legislative priority that the ministers, it cuts across ministries, that they usually try to advance. And a similar thing or a similar process exists in different countries across the Caribbean, where ministers identify what is on their priority list and seek to move it. So it would be important for them to ensure as a first step that these food policies are on their legislative priority, and in particular matters in relation to regulating iTFAs, because there are a range of entry points, as I highlighted in my presentation, in which they can seek to introduce this particular regulatory measure.
Yes, thank you. And maybe this is where CARICOM can come in, because they could give us like a progress report. CARICOM passed the recommendation for this legislation. So now maybe CARICOM needs to come back and say, well, you know, this is what is happening wherever. I see Liz on, and Liz, I want to put you on the spot again about this global approach to trans fats. How can we, in fact, look? There are only a few countries that are producing partially hydrogenated oils. How can we identify these countries? And having identified them, what then?
It's a great question, Professor Samuels. And, you know, I think I would go as far to say it's not even that there's just a few countries, it's only a few global suppliers. We know that the global PHO supply chain is really dominated by about, I mean, there's probably more than 10 global manufacturers, but we kind of know it's dominated by about 6 or 8 major players, and they have refineries all over the world. It's a tricky question because of the nature of industry. It's very hard to see exactly who's producing where in what countries. You know, industry is not particularly forthcoming on this sort of with this information, and it's and I think it's also important to note that, you know, partially hydrogenated oils are just a small component of these companies. So, you know, some of the biggest producers are Bunge, I don't know how you say it, Bunge, ADM, used to be Cargill. You know, these are huge multinational companies that make lots of different products, and partially hydrogenated oil is just a very small component of that. So kind of targeting them on PHO is both compelling in some ways because it's such a small part of their product share, their market, that, you know, you could say like, well, if you just stop making it, you know, it's only a little part, but also when they can also respond and say, well, it's, you know, it's a small part of the market, and, you know, it's, you know, why should we bother? I mean, we have had some success. I say you know, there has been some success on the PHO suppliers and with industry. You know, I think you always have to take a little bit of grain of salt with what they say, or, you know, be wary of statements made by manufacturers. But Cargill claims that they are now in line with WHO best practice, that none of their products contain more than 2% iTFA, which, if true, is fantastic. We have no way to verify that, but they do make products in countries that they do sell them products in countries where there's regulation. So we trust that they know how to make those products. But in terms of what we can do, I think advocacy, you know, I think the more countries have regulations, the less incentive there is for these countries to make PHO, particularly the bigger countries. I think, you know, the onus should be on the major markets to kind of take action, and then, you know, the benefit will fall to the smaller countries. But it's a really tricky piece because we haven't worked it out in the 5 to 6 years we've been working on this. We are now investigating a little bit about the supply chain in more depth and kind of trying to come up with an index for these manufacturers with an organization called the Access to Nutrition Initiative. So hopefully next year we'll be releasing a PHO market index. We'll kind of benchmark these manufacturers and kind of show how they perform. And then hopefully that will lead to investor action. But many of these countries are privately held, so companies are privately held. So it is really tricky, and I don't think we have a good answer. But at a country level, we have found that kind of, you know, direct advocacy, engaging with government, and kind of showing really strongly to government and to other interested parties that you don't need PHO in food, and that it is possible to replace, has been winning. But yeah, unfortunately, there's no really strong answer, but we are working on it, and hopefully in the next year we'll have a better guidance and a way forward. So yeah,
Yes.
Sorry for the rambling answer, but there's no clear-cut way to go ahead.
But you're working on it. You're working on it.
Yes, we are working on it. On it. I actually,
Very good.
Daniel's got his hand up, but I just wanted to, my question was for all the panelists, and it's been really fascinating. If you don't mind my asking, what is, I just wanted to know, you know, it sounds like a regional regulation is not feasible for the region, and that's very understandable. What is the kind of, and you mentioned a race, Professor Samuels, what's the likelihood that, say, if one country passes a legislation for trans fat, that many others will kind of be motivated and follow? Is that kind of a topple over effect that you might hope for?
I think you will see some of that. If we look at, for example, sugar taxes, there are, you know, a number of Caribbean countries, not the majority, but still a significant minority who have taxes on sugar. So I think that's a possibility. There's a hand up. Victor, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think, Lafia, this you have raised a very interesting legal question. What happens when a country bans an ingredient classified as a toxic rather than a safe ingredient in foods, but allows the production for export? This is an international law question. Very interesting. Nicole Foster might have something to say. Could Mexico allow the production of cocaine for export?
Oh, well, let's not even go there. But Cheryl, in terms of trans fats, is it Mexico has banned it? Is it legal, therefore, for Mexico to produce it only for export?
The law doesn't talk about exportation, but it bans, regardless of the intention to export or for national consumption, it bans the production, the sale and commercialization of partially hydrogenated oils, and it limits trans fatty acid content to 2%.
Right. So what is legal? So to follow from what Victor has mentioned and your question, Alafia, what is legal or not legal in another context is really it really depends on the context and the country. So what are their laws that speak to importation and exportation? You know what, this is really guided. So there's no clear cut, or I can't give a clear cut without further consideration. This is something that we'd have to look at further within the particular context, you know, having regard to each country's national context, their legislation, you know, also in terms of their region and in terms of any regional commitments, you know, we have to look at that and then look at whatever our global commitments are. I know that the time is up, but just to answer something that Liz had placed on the table earlier, you know, what might be easier and whether or not countries would be minded to implement if they see other countries implementing. Having observed and to some degree been a part of some parliamentary discussions, what I've seen is that it really helps. And usually when legislators sit at the table and they're analyzing policies or legislation, it always helps in terms of support when they can see or when you can draw on other countries, especially in a regional context, which has done it. So it serves as a motivating factor, and they're often inclined to put that in place where they can see it happening by their regional counterparts. You're mute, Alafia.
I'm saying we saw that with tobacco. The FCTC, yes. So we saw that going across the region and different countries being motivated by other countries having done it. Okay, well, thank you very much, everyone. I think we had a very interesting panel, and I'm going to turn over to Maisha for the closing. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. We are over time, but I just wanted to underscore the gratitude that we have at HCC for all of the partners who presented in the webinar or provided opening remarks, and more importantly, who have been holding our hands, holding each other's hands as we embark on this advocacy journey to accelerate the implementation of TFA regulation in the Caribbean. So thanks to everyone. Thank you, all of you who joined us today. We're delighted that you took time out of your Friday morning to be with us. We will be continuing to educate the community through a regional campaign, through national activities, through the organizations that you've heard from today. And so stay tuned. We will have a dedicated space on HCC's website. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great day and a lovely weekend. Thank you all.